Dust turned the horizon into a faded painting, the sky the color of worn denim. A single rider came along the road that cut through the plain, his shadow long and lean, his horse's hooves thudding like a steady heart. The town ahead lay quiet, its street half asleep under the sun, only a dog stretching in the shade of the saloon porch. The rider didn't hurry. He rode as though he belonged to silence itself, hat brim low, dust hanging to him like another layer of clothing. The wooden front of the general store stood in the middle of town like a stubborn tooth in an empty jaw. As the cowboy dismounted, tying his horse to the post, he heard voices, sharp, unfriendly, coming from a porch. A woman stood there, clutching the railing as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Her dress, once pale blue, had been patched with fabric that didn't match. Sun had taken the color from her hair, leaving it a dull gold, but her face, though tired, still held something unbroken in it. The storekeeper stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. "No more credit," he said. No man had left his name for her. She asked again, voice soft, not begging but near breaking. "Bread, only bread." His answer was final. The cowboy stood still, boots planted in the dust, watching. The world seemed to wait with him. The woman's shoulders sagged. For a moment, she looked like she might sink to the floor. He stepped forward. The door creaked as he entered the store, his spurs whispering on the wood. Inside, the air smelled of grain and soap. He picked up a small sack of flour and a loaf of bread, laid coins on the counter, and walked out without a word. On the porch, he held out the bread. She stared at him as if he had offered her gold. Her fingers hesitated before they touched it, careful, as though afraid it might disappear. When she took it, she straightened a little. Her thanks was barely a breath, but something passed between them, acknowledgement, gratitude, a thread that neither pulled on. She sank onto the porch step and tore the bread carefully, as though sharing with an unseen guest, chewing slow. The cowboy didn't leave. He stood nearby, hands loose at his sides, looking out over the street as if watching for nothing at all. After a while, she spoke without looking up. Her husband had left months ago, taking what little they had and riding south. She had followed him for weeks, believing he might come back. But he hadn't. She had no family close, no work. Nights, she stayed in a cabin no one used at the edge of town, roof leaking, but still standing. Her voice didn't shake. She wasn't telling it for pity, just letting the words out, because there was someone to hear them. He nodded once, the brim of his hat dipping. When she finished, he crouched near her and said, quiet as a prayer, that she didn't have to stay here. There was space at his place, a roof that didn't leak. She stiffened, almost angry. She said she was no charity case, that people would talk. He didn't move. He just said winter was coming, and no one should face it alone if there was another way. His voice was steady, unbothered by her pride. She sat there a long moment, staring at the bread in her lap. When she finally nodded, it was small, almost to herself. She climbed onto the back of his horse when the sun was lowering. Neither spoke as they left the town behind. The road stretched wide, the sky darkening into a wash of pink and gray. He rode ahead, posture easy in the saddle. She held on to the back of the saddle horn, eyes on the ground passing beneath. With each mile, the sound of the town faded until there was only the soft thud of hooves and the whisper of wind through grass. When night came, stars came with it, so many that the sky seemed to breathe. She looked up once, holding her breath. She hadn't noticed the stars in months. At the edge of his land, he helped her down. The cabin stood quiet under the moon, smoke rising from the chimney as though it had been waiting for someone to come home. Inside, the fire still held warmth. He lit a lamp, its glow turning the small room gold. The table had one chair, the bed pushed against the wall. There was nothing grand about the place, but it was clean, cared for. He told her she could take the bed. He would sleep near the fire. She stood for a while, holding her small bundle of belongings. Then, very slowly, she set them down. When she lay down that night, she listened to the quiet, the crackle of the fire, the soft creak as he settled onto the floor. For the first time in a long time, the dark did not feel dangerous. Sleep came to her gentle as rain, and she let it take her, knowing morning would come with something she had not felt in months. Hope morning came soft and gray, the kind that smells of damp earth and wood smoke. She woke to the sound of him splitting kindling outside, each strike steady and unhurried. For a moment she lay still, listening, letting the sound soak into her bones. It was a sound of work, of someone staying when they said they would. In the days that followed, life took on a shape she had almost forgotten. She mended his shirts, patched the curtains, swept dust from corners no one had bothered with in years. He taught her to scatter feed for the chickens, to stack wood so it would dry for winter. Their words were few, but something in the quiet between them grew warm. Sometimes, in the evenings, they would sit on the porch. He smoked, hat tipped back, while she stitched or just watched the sky darken. It wasn't a loud companionship. It was the kind that made her feel seen without being stared at, safe without being caged. One night, as autumn gathered its chill, she found a small wildflower in a chipped jar on the table. He said nothing about it, and neither did she, but her fingers lingered on the petals as if they had been touched by sunlight. Weeks passed. Her face grew fuller, her hands steadier. The lines of hunger left her eyes. But one afternoon, when she went to fetch water, a shadow fell across the yard that was colder than the coming winter. He had returned. Her husband, or the man who had once called himself that, leaned against the fence rail as though he owned the place. His clothes were ragged, but his grin was still cruel. He said she belonged to him, that she had no right to be here. Her knees wanted to give, but she made them stand firm. She told him she was done waiting, done starving, done carrying his name. The cowboy came from a barn then, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his gun. He only walked until he stood between them, his shadow long on the ground. His voice was quiet, but it had weight in it. The man sneered, cursed, but when the cowboy didn't flinch, didn't blink, he backed away. That night, rain hammered the roof and turned the yard to mud. She sat near the fire, staring into the flames. When he came in, soaked from checking the barn, he found her crying. Not loud, not broken, just tears that slid down like something finally giving way. She said she had been afraid she would never be more than a burden, that she was only something men used and left. He knelt by the hearth, rain still in his hair, and said softly that she had never been a burden, that she was the reason this house felt like a home. The storm outside roared, but inside something stilled. At dawn, before the world had dried, hoofbeats returned. Her husband had come again, drunk this time, with a pistol in his hand. He shouted, demanding food, money, anything he could take. The cowboy stepped outside barehanded, telling her to stay inside. The air between the two men was sharp enough to cut. The gun wavered, the man cursing, threatening. Then it happened fast, too fast for her to breathe. The cowboy lunged, caught the man's wrist, twisted until the gun fell into the mud. The fight was brief but fierce, ending with the man face down in the dirt, his pride more wounded than his body. He scrambled up, spitting threats, but the cowboy only pointed toward the road. His voice was low, final. The man staggered to his horse and left for good. The yard was quiet again. The gun lay forgotten in the mud. She came out then, feet bare on the wet ground. He looked at her, chest heaving, and for a moment neither moved. Then she crossed the space between them and laid her hand against his cheek. No words passed, because none were needed. Later, as the sun broke through, they sat on the porch together. The sky was washed clean, the air smelling of wet earth and pine. She leaned against him, feeling the steady weight of his arm around her shoulders. She realized then that the hunger that had driven her to beg for bread had been more than the hunger of the body. It had been the hunger of the soul. He had given her bread, yes, but more than that, he had given her back herself. And as the day stretched out before them, quiet and wide, she understood that this was where she would stay. Hope was no longer something far off. It was here, warm beside her, silent as the man who had carried it home. If you love quiet, heartfelt Wild West tales like this one, saddle up and subscribe so you never miss the next story by the fire.